Okay, let's unpack this. We're stepping back into the mid-20th century, Southeast Asia specifically, but we're not just, looking at a historical event.
No, not at all.
We're really trying to analyze a strategic puzzle. The Vietnam War, it just casts such a long shadow.
It really does.
And it's not just because of its impact on American society, but because it was, fundamentally, a defining case study in what we now call hybrid warfare.
Exactly, and that's a strategic approach that, frankly, continues to challenge military planners to this day.
That's the core of our deep dive today, isn't it?
It is. It was the ultimate test case for how a highly committed, let's say less technologically advanced adversary could actually defeat a global superpower.
By just refusing to play by one set of rules.
By refusing to play by a single set of rules. So for you, the mission today is to understand the strategic complexity that was faced by the United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam and its commander, General William C. Westmoreland.
And we do that by dissecting the enemy's core methodology.
That's right.
Our mission is centered on the Vietnamese communists' comprehensive strategy, which is known as Do Tran, or struggle. We need to really define this doctrine and analyze why this unified hybrid approach proved so devastatingly effective.
Especially against an opponent that possessed, just overwhelming firepower, mobility, resources, you name it.
This wasn't just a failure of attrition, was it?
No, it was a failure of strategic imagination.
So, to guide our analysis, we're drawing on some pretty critical historical and strategic documents.
We are. We're leaning heavily on Dale Andrade's analysis, and Westmoreland was right, learning the wrong lessons from the Vietnam War, which really pushes back against a lot of the common post-war narratives.
Okay.
We're also using Martin Clemis's deep historical context, which you can find in Revolutionary War and the Vietnam conflict and the Road to America's Vietnam War.
And there's one more.
Right. And we'll be using Douglas Pike's examination of the communist grand strategy, particularly his insights on perception and communication. That's in his Conduct of the Vietnam War, Strategic Factors, 1965-1968.
And taken together, these documents help us move beyond the emotional narratives and really focus on what the enemy's actual intent and capabilities were.
Exactly.
So before the first major American ground troops even arrived in 1965, this conflict was already, 3 decades in the making?
At least. Our sources really emphasized that the groundwork for intervention was laid by 4 powerful converging historical forces.
And it's so crucial. We see this as fundamentally rooted in Vietnamese history, not just another Cold War proxy fight.
That perspective is absolutely essential because it reveals the depth of the commitment on the northern side. The first force was just this fierce anti-colonial nationalism.
French colonialism.
For nearly a century, France had controlled Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia and transformed them into territories of, exploitation. French rule was just characterized by intense moral and material poverty.
Can you give us some more detail on that? What was life actually like for an average Vietnamese peasant under French rule?
The deprivation was structural. It was built into the system. The French administrators, they were focused solely on profit, on extracting raw materials, rice, rubber, coal, but they provided almost nothing back.
In terms of infrastructure or social stability?
Nothing. Clemis details how the rubber plantations, for example, were run almost like death camps. Most peasants survived by farming, but land ownership was heavily concentrated.
So they were tenants on their own land?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tenancy rates just soared, often reaching 80 to 90% in the Mekong Delta, which was heavily populated. It left farmers destitute and just perpetually in debt.
And beyond the economic side?
Beyond the economic hardship, there was a calculated effort to degrade Vietnamese culture, to suppress any aspirations for self-determination.
So this systematic exploitation, it creates this deep well of anti-French hatred that just fuels the revolution.
It really does. And this widespread hardship provided incredibly fertile ground for the second major force, Marxism-Leninism.
Right, because the traditional nationalist resistance movements, which were often led by Western-educated elites, they had been brutally crushed by the French.
Crushed, which left a huge political vacuum.
Yeah.
The existing nationalist movements were either too weak or too disorganized to effectively counter French brutality.
Yeah.
And Marxism-Leninism, particularly the anti-imperialist variant that Vladimir Lenin promoted, it offered this scathing indictment of imperialism.
And more importantly, a practical blueprint for its destruction.
A highly organized blueprint.
Yeah.
Ho Chi Minh, who is the towering figure of this revolution, had actually sought help from the West first.
He even petitioned for Vietnamese independence at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919.
He did, only to be completely ignored.
And once he realized the West just wasn't interested in dismantling its own colonial systems, he turned east.
He did. And it's vital to recognize his dual identity, as Clemis really emphasizes this. He was a fierce anti-colonial nationalist, dedicated to liberating his people, and a devout Marxist-Leninist.
So his commitment wasn't just tactical.
Not at all. He genuinely believed this ideology offered the only path forward for the oppressed. His personal hatred for the injustices of the French colonial system, it just fused nationalism and communism.
Creating a movement that was far more potent than any other anti-French group.
And that's the key. The cause of Vietnamese independence and the communist cause became, for all intents and purposes, one and the same.
Which brings us to the third force you mentioned, decolonization, which was really accelerated by the trauma of World War II.
Right. The Japanese occupation of Indochina, starting in 1940, completely stripped France of its power and its prestige in the region.
It created a power vacuum.
A massive power vacuum. And although the Japanese administration was often brutal, it facilitated the rise of the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh were the only indigenous force really positioned to step into that vacuum.
And they truly earned their political stature during that horrific famine of 1944 and 1945, didn't they?
They absolutely did. That famine, which killed nearly 2 million people, it just demonstrated the complete failure of both the French and the Japanese to care for the population. The Viet Minh stepped in.
What did they do?
They seized rice from granaries and redistributed it to the starving population. This simple, decisive act of social justice just propelled them into a new level of political stature.
So when Japan surrendered in August 1945,
Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh swiftly declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. To many Vietnamese, this was it. This was the legitimate, hard-won independence they had been fighting for.
But of course, the French wanted their colony back.
Which sparked the First Indochina War.
And that conflict immediately ran headlong into the Fourth, and for the Americans, the ultimately dominant factor, the Cold War.
The Cold War transformed everything. It took a local anti-colonial civil conflict and turned it into a global ideological containment struggle.
Right.
For the United States, arresting the spread of communism became the dominant national security priority, especially after the fall of China and the Korean War.
So the U.S. starts fitting the bill for the French war effort. I think by 1952, it was over 40% of the total cost.
That's right. And the goal wasn't supporting colonialism.
It was stopping communism.
Correct. The real politic basis for U.S. involvement was this perception that preserving a non-communist Republic of Vietnam was just vital to global anti-communist containment. This was tied deeply to the Munich syndrome, the imperative to stop aggression early.
And the domino theory.
And the domino theory, which feared that if South Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would follow.
This First Indochina War culminates with that decisive French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
A huge defeat. It forced France to the 1954 Geneva Accords, which officially ended the war. But the most critical outcome was the temporary partitioning of Vietnam at the 17th parallel.
Creating North Vietnam and South Vietnam.
The Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the state of Vietnam in the south.
Now, the Accords explicitly called for reunification elections in 1956 to decide the country's fate. Why did those elections never happen?
They never happened because the United States and the new South Vietnamese leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, they intervened.
They were afraid Ho Chi Minh would win.
The United States feared that Ho Chi Minh, because of his immense popularity and the Viet Minh's success in driving out the French, would win a nationwide election easily. So Diem, with U.S. backing, held a fraudulent plebiscite in 1955.
And declared himself president.
Declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam, and then actively prevented the reunification elections that were called for by the Geneva Accords.
So, by refusing to allow that political settlement to take place, Diem and the U.S. essentially guaranteed that the conflict would revert to a military struggle.
It hardened the division. It completely transformed what might have been a political outcome into a continuous civil conflict, and it set the stage for the Second Indochina War. The North Vietnamese leaders just viewed the South Vietnamese government as completely illegitimate, installed by foreign powers.
So force was the only option left.
They believed that only force could achieve their national goal of unification.
Okay, so once that division was solidified, the North was forced to formalize the strategy they would use to fight, and that brings us directly to Giao Tranh, or struggle.
Right. And Douglas Pike describes this as the unique Vietnamese communist methodology for warfare. He emphasizes that they made absolutely no distinction between war and politics.
This dualistic nature is the key to understanding the sheer complexity the Americans were facing.
It really is. Dartron is a single, unified national effort. It combines military and political domains seamlessly.
And Pike offers that perfect metaphor.
He does, the hammer and the anvil. Victory is achieved by the hammer of Dao Tram Vu Trang, that's armed struggle, or military action landing on the anvil of Dao Tran Shen, try the political struggle.
I think the most important takeaway for you, our listener, here is the insistence that neither the hammer nor the anvil could win alone. They were mutually reinforcing, right?
Absolutely. The armed struggle, the hammer, it provides the necessary military force and violence to wear down the enemy's strength and, just as important, to protect the communist infrastructure in the South.
But it's the political struggle, the anvil, that focuses on securing the allegiance of the civilian population.
Or at least their obedience. Without popular support, the anvil, the hammer, would just be smashing empty air.
And without the military force, the hammer, the political cadres, would be vulnerable to immediate repression.
Exactly. They needed each other to function.
So let's dive into the specifics of the political struggle, the Dao Tran Chin Tri, because this is where the genius of their political military apparatus truly lay. It targeted specific populations through 3 distinct action programs, or VAN.
Yes, the 3 VAN programs. And they illustrate how Dao Tran covered every base, from the local village all the way to the international arena. First, we have Dan Van, or action among the people.
This was the grassroots component.
Exactly. Focused internally on mobilizing the masses, recruiting local fighters and partisans, and just generating popular unrest against Saigon regime.
What did Dan Van actually look like in practice in the villages? How did they implement it?
This was the construction of the revolutionary shadow government. Dan Van meant establishing parallel hierarchies, communist village committees, youth leagues, women's associations, that ran parallel to the South Vietnamese government structures.
So they were building a state within a state.
That's a perfect way to put it. It often involved land reform, redistributing land from wealthy landlords to poor peasants, and the meticulous study of individual social circumstances to identify local grievances that could be exploited.
So the goal was to deeply embed the communist infrastructure within the social fabric of the countryside.
To make the communist presence indistinguishable from local life.
Okay, second is ditch van, or action among the enemy. This seems less about military action and more about global strategic communication and manipulation.
It was entirely psychological and political warfare aimed at the external world, but with profound internal consequences. The goal of ditch van was to isolate the Saigon regime and, crucially, the United States.
Isolate them globally.
Globally. By manipulating public opinion abroad and gaining sympathy for the revolution. This is where you see the deliberate framing of the war, not as a communist invasion, but as a righteous struggle for national liberation against foreign aggression.
So this is the pillar that utilized and maybe even fomented the anti-war movement in the West.
Precisely. They were absolute masters of strategic communication. They used every platform, from international conferences to peace groups, to highlight perceived atrocities or military blunders committed by the Americans.
Fostering public outrage and political opposition.
And seeking to turn American democratic ideals against the American effort itself.
And finally, the third pillar, Binh Van, or action among the military. This targeted the South Vietnamese army and government officials directly.
Binh Van was internal political warfare, aimed squarely at demoralizing and subverting the adversary's own organization. This was carried out through leaflets, broadcasts, familial pressure, direct communication.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Communist cadres would often use the families of soldiers in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam who lived in communist-controlled or contested areas to pressure them to desert or refuse to fight.
And the message was always?
The message was always, you are fighting for a corrupt, foreign-backed regime against your own countrymen. It worked to induce defection, distrust, disloyalty. It was a constant drain on the morale and readiness of the South Vietnamese forces.
So we're talking about a foe whose strategic vision was inherently comprehensive. It's unifying grassroots mobilization, diplomatic isolation, and military confrontation into a single cohesive organ.
That's right. And that organizational contrast, as we noted earlier, is one of the war's great lessons. The U.S. response was so institutionally compartmentalized, military, diplomatic, political, it just failed to match that single unified Dao Tran apparatus.
That structural inability to unify a response is why Pike's analysis remains so potent today.
It is. However, the application of Dao Tran wasn't static, it changed. By the late 1950s, The hardliners in the Vietnamese Workers' Party Politburo, led by Linh Duan, they decided that the protracted political struggle was just too slow.
They needed to accelerate the war.
Right. And this led to the strategic decision to escalate the war in the South with Resolution 15 in 1959. This sanctioned the shift to main force warfare.
Resolution 15 was the trigger.
It was the trigger. It officially authorized the use of armed struggle to topple the Saigon regime, and critically, it formalized the infiltration route that became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
And this immediately led to the formation of the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam.
Often called the Viet Cong, yes.
Yeah.
It unified the southern political and military resistance.
And the communists quickly moved from these small, localized guerrilla bands to much larger, more lethal formations.
Much larger. By 1963, they were fielding increasingly large and well-equipped units, organized into battalions and even regiments. And Hanoi began adding its own northern main forces, North Vietnamese Army troops, to the mix by late 1964.
So this was no longer solely a peasant insurgency.
Oh no, this was a national military campaign supported by a very large foreign power. The Politburo ordered a massive change in strategy, aiming for strong massed combat operations to seek a decisive victory before the United States could intervene with ground forces.
The insurgency had fully evolved into a hybrid main force threat.
It had.
And this rapid escalation and the shift in communist strategy brings us directly to the great strategic debate surrounding the U.S. defeat.
Right. Dale Andrade's analysis really helps us dissect the two main schools of historical thought that emerged after the war schools that he argues are ultimately misleading simplifications because they only saw half the problem.
So these two schools, they essentially argued that the United States failed because it misidentified the true nature of the war.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
On one side, you had the Clausewitzians, championed by figures like Colonel Harry Summers. Their central argument was that the war was a classic conventional invasion by North Vietnam.
And therefore, the real military center of gravity was Hanoi.
Exactly. So they saw the Viet Cong guerrillas as merely an extension of the North Vietnamese army, and they argued that counterinsurgency was, for the most part, irrelevant.
So for the Clausewitzians, the failure was political, not military.
Right. The military should have been allowed to use its massive conventional power to attack the enemy's centers of gravity directly, meaning the base areas in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam itself.
And this interpretation was pretty popular in the army post-1975.
Very popular, because it shifted the blame away from the military's conventional approach and onto the political restrictions that were imposed by Washington.
But then you have the complete opposite view, the hearts and minders, articulated by people like Andrew Krepinovich. What was their argument?
They argued that the conventionally minded U.S. military, led by General William C. Westmoreland, just ignored essential counterinsurgency principles and failed to secure the population.
So they felt the loss was a moral and political failure.
Yes, because the military prioritized these large unit operations over protecting the populace and winning their allegiance. For the hearts and minders, political allegiance in the South was the true center of gravity, and they accused Westmoreland of squandering the opportunity to defeat the enemy at the village level.
But the crux of the issue, which Andrade highlights through Michael Hennessy's work, is that the reality was just far more complex than either of these simplified narratives allowed.
And that's the key insight into hybrid warfare. The communists employed simultaneously a potent guerrilla structure and heavy main forces. By December 1965, intelligence was counting about 160 communist main force battalions in the South.
And many of them were North Vietnamese army units.
A lot of them were. It was a sophisticated melding of guerrilla and main force capabilities, which means any strategy that ignored one element was just destined to fail against the complete doctrine structure.
So let's look at General Westmoreland's predicament. When he takes command of Military Assistance Command Vietnam in 1964 and 1965, the sources make it clear South Vietnam was on the verge of outright defeat.
It was an absolute crisis point. The sheer destructive capability of the North Vietnamese Army main forces meant the South Vietnamese Army was collapsing.
So Westmoreland's immediate priority wasn't winning hearts and minds.
No, it was preventing the outright collapse of the state. He reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the Democratic Republic of Vietnam would commit whatever forces it deemed necessary, and the government of Vietnam just could not stand up to that pressure without massive American reinforcement.
And this informed his rationale for pursuing a strategy of attrition.
It did. Focused on destroying or expelling enemy main forces through what we know as search and destroy operations.
What was the explicit logic behind prioritizing attrition?
His reasoning was urgent and very practical. Attrition was necessary to buy time, to provide the secure environment that was required for pacification and nation-building to succeed.
Because the main forces could win faster.
The enemy main forces, organized into regiments, could achieve victory, the destruction of the South Vietnamese state, much, much faster than guerrillas and political cadres ever could. You just can't conduct effective hearts and minds programs if battalion-sized North Vietnamese units are capable of overwhelming and destroying entire provincial capitals.
And the source material shows that Westmoreland wasn't ignorant of the political dimension.
Far from it, no. He fully supported the creation of the Civil Operations and Rural Development Support Organization, or CORDS, in 1967. He believed the war was a political as well as a military war.
So his strategy was a division of labor.
It was a division of labor. American conventional units would tackle the immediate existential threat, the enemy main forces out in the unpopulated border areas. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese forces, with their shared language and culture, would focus on area security and pacification in the populated areas.
Critics often cite alternative strategies he should have adopted instead of these large-scale search-and-destroy operations. Let's look at two of the most popular ones. First, the enclave strategy.
Right, the enclave strategy.
Yeah.
It was proposed by Ambassador Maxwell Taylor, and it suggested static defense around key population centers, particularly coastal cities,
To minimize U.S. casualties.
and protect the most crucial areas. Westmoreland dismissed this because he argued it was strategically defensive and it just ceded the initiative entirely to the enemy.
It would allow the North Vietnamese army free rein in the countryside.
Free rein. They could build up strength, operate with impunity, and eventually surround and strangle the defensive enclaves. He feared the Allies would become holed up, just awaiting an inevitable loss.
And the second alternative, the one that's often pointed to as the model of what should have been done, was the wide dispersal of small, effective units modeled on the combined action platoons used by the Marine Corps.
The Combined Action Platoon program, yeah. It involved small Marine teams living and fighting right alongside South Vietnamese militia platoons in the villages.
And Westmoreland acknowledged they were effective locally.
He did, but he feared that dispersing the limited American manpower into these small groups risked them being overwhelmed by the increasingly large and powerful communist formations.
And even the Marine Corps had to adapt.
The Marine Corps itself, despite championing the program, was forced to reorient a significant portion of its time toward larger unit operations by 1966. Why? Because the North Vietnamese Army main forces were infiltrating their zone of operations in ever greater numbers. The strategic reality was that the main force threat held the initiative, and it demanded a centralized military response.
Okay, so despite the military success of U.S. forces in pushing the enemy away from populated areas, which did stabilize South Vietnam temporarily, the failure of attrition ultimately sealed the fate of the strategy. Why did it fail?
It failed on two fronts, and both of them were structural limitations imposed in Washington, not military failures in the field. The first was replacement capacity. Westmoreland had hoped that the crossover point, where the number of enemy soldiers killed would permanently outstrip their ability to replace them, could be reached. This was an unrealistic hope.
Why?
Demographic studies showed that North Vietnam had more than 120,000 young men reaching draft age every single year. Even with high casualty rates in the South, running about 85,000 per year, the communist forces could easily sustain losses at that rate for decades.
So physically destroying the enemy was mathematically impossible.
It was. The strategy just couldn't destroy the enemy's capacity. And the second, and perhaps more damning failure, was the strategic limitations imposed on the U.S. effort.
This is the critical point that Andrade and Westmoreland really emphasized later.
It is. The roots of the attrition strategy's failure lay in Washington's decision to declare major communist base areas and logistical arteries in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam itself off limits to significant attack.
Sanctuaries.
The North Vietnamese were receiving massive logistical and material support from China. And the Soviet Union Chinese sources show hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition and weaponry flowing south, and they had secure home fronts and staging areas. The United States essentially granted Hanoi this strategic advantage of sanctuary.
It was an unbeatable advantage.
It really was. The United States gave North Vietnam a guaranteed secure zone for recovery and resupply, often located just across an arbitrarily drawn border. This meant the Allies would always be fighting a strategic defensive war inside South Vietnam, just waiting for the next round of attacks. The enemy could limp back across the border whenever they were bloodied, resupply, and return at a time and place of their choosing.
So the ultimate goal of attrition, to force Hanoi to stop fighting by making the cost too high, was impossible.
It was impossible to achieve under those profound strategic constraints.
The moment American troops arrived, Hanoi's grand strategy shifted dramatically. They recognized the scale of the new challenge. This marks the regular force strategy period, which Douglas Pike dates from early 1965 to mid-1968.
Right, and this period necessitated a doctrinal reversal, temporarily emphasizing the armed struggle over the political struggle.
Pike calls this the quick victory or go for broke doctrine.
It does. The goal was simple: achieve unification quickly by applying intensive military pressure through main forces before the massive American buildup could fully materialize.
So the North Vietnamese leadership, particularly General Von Nguyen Giap, had to devise an entirely new strategic response to the American technological revolution.
They absolutely do.
What were the key American advantages that General Giap was specifically trying to neutralize?
Well, overwhelming firepower, certainly, but also American air power, including the heavy use of D-52 strikes, and crucially, superior mobility enabled by the helicopter.
Right, the helicopter was everywhere.
It was. American forces could arise suddenly in areas that were previously considered inaccessible, disrupting the communists' ability to mass forces or manage logistics. This forced a radical adaptation.
So how did the communist forces adapt to this crushing technological superiority?
They countered in two major ways. First, they countered mass with mass and technology with counter-technology. The whole notion that the communist forces were fighting only with crude, homemade weapons is just totally inaccurate for this period.
They were getting help from the socialist camp?
Massive infusions of sophisticated modern weaponry. B-40 barrage rockets, 152mm artillery pieces, advanced anti-aircraft guns, and of course the rugged AK-47 assault rifle. They had the best weapons the socialist camp could manufacture.
And second, they developed two primary fighting methods.
Yes, designed to counter the American strengths and exploit their weaknesses, combining them into what General Giap called the comprehensive offensive. The first was the coordinated fighting method, or cash down, hop down.
And this was a primary assignment for the North Vietnamese Army and main force Viet Cong units.
Correct. It involved large unit attacks against important fixed targets, all designed to lure American forces into pitched battles.
These battles, like Doc 2 and Loc Ninh in 1967, were incredibly brutal. But what was the tactical genius behind these operations?
The genius lay in how they negated American air power. These attacks always took place in favorable terrain, inaccessible jungles or mountains that reduced American maneuverability.
And critically,
the North Vietnamese forces would assault an American or South Vietnamese installation, and once engaged, they would immediately clutch the enemy's belt. They'd close the distance rapidly, often fighting within just a few meters of the defenders.
To make the defenders' proximity too close for the Americans to safely call in their own air and artillery strikes?
Precisely. The installation itself became the attacker's shield against the most devastating American advantage: air power. The proximity of friendly forces created a no-strike zone, denying the U.S. the ability to use its massive advantage in supporting fire.
And once the objective was met,
Once the target was successfully assaulted or enough casualties were inflicted, the attackers would just vanish back into the nearby sanctuaries across the border. This guaranteed a high rate of American casualties and protected the main communist forces from annihilation.
that's a perfect example of tactical innovation designed to solve a very specific technological problem.
It is. The other method was the independent fighting method, or cash down doc lap. This was essentially a reversion to small-scale guerrilla tactics, normally assigned to regional and territorial guerrilla units.
What was the strategic purpose of the independent fighting method if it couldn't achieve a decisive victory?
Well, it was crucial for maintaining political control and draining American resources without suffering heavy losses.
Yep.
It conserved manpower, it avoided costly head-to-head fights, and it continued the Dan Van and Bin Van programs.
So it maintained the anvil of the political struggle.
Exactly. But as a standalone military effort, it could never be strategically decisive against the massive U.S. and South Vietnamese main forces. It just maintained the pressure.
And this doctrinal evolution culminates in the campaign that really crystallized both the military and political aspects of hybrid warfare, the 1968 Tet Offensive.
Tet was the crescendo of the 1967-1968 Winter-Spring campaign. Phase 1 involved those coordinated fighting method battles we just discussed, luring American forces into bloody border fights like Dak To.
And phase two.
Phase 2 culminated in the massive coordinated attacks of the Tet Offensive, primarily employing the independent fighting method in and around urban areas across virtually every major city and town in South Vietnam.
The conventional wisdom is that Tet was a massive military disaster for the communists, but a resounding political victory. Can we unpack the scale of that disaster?
The military failure was staggering. The offensive was quickly repulsed, often within days. They lost as many as 85,000 of their best troops,
Including the seasoned political cadres.
including many of the seasoned Viet Cong political cadres and fighters. General Giap had hoped the offensive would trigger the long-awaited general uprising among the southern population, a core social myth of their doctrine, but the population did not rise up to join them.
Yet, despite those catastrophic losses, the psychological impact in the U.S. was profound.
Absolutely resounding. This is the ultimate example of successful ditch fan. The coordination and sheer scale of the attacks. I mean, seeing fighting inside the U.S. Embassy compound, it completely shattered the prevailing narrative among the American public and media that the war was being won.
Or at least that it was nearing an end.
Right. The resulting crisis of perception led directly to President Lyndon B. Johnson's decision to halt the bombing of North Vietnam and step down for the presidency.
They achieved a political and psychological victory that they could never have achieved on the battlefield alone. The strategic test had been shifted.
And that's the key takeaway from Tet. It validated the core tenet of Datron. The political struggle, the anvil, was ultimately the decisive factor. They understood that the vulnerability of the American effort lay not in its military capability, but in its political resolve and the limits of its democratic system.
Douglas Pike's assertion that the Vietnam War was a prison of competing perceptions is such a powerful concept.
It really is.
It suggests that the most damaging strategic factor wasn't a specific military blunder or political misjudgment, but the fundamental shared lack of consensus on the very nature of the war itself.
A lack of consensus on what it was, who was fighting, and what even constituted victory or defeat.
And that strategic ambiguity prevented the United States from ever developing a unity of purpose or a truly coherent, integrated strategy.
It did. Pike notes that the U.S. committed itself to the war and only then started to think about it comprehensively. The highest levels of American leadership never devoted themselves to systematic, objective analysis of the enemy's thinking or their doctrine.
They were fighting a war defined by American political logic, not by Vietnamese revolutionary logic.
Exactly. And this brings us to the core U.S. failure in strategic analysis, characterized by what Aldous Huxley called vincible ignorance.
Vincible ignorance.
This wasn't just honest ignorance. It was the failure to study what they did not know but absolutely needed to know.
It speaks to a profound structural and intellectual arrogance.
A syndrome of superior professionalism. The American military and civilian leadership possessed such incredible capability on the battlefield that this capability itself became an obsession. It led to the tendency to do what they were able to do, large-scale conventional operations, rather than what actually needed to be done.
Which was a unified, integrated political military response.
Yes. And we see this play out just devastatingly in the anecdote about high-level officials failing to analyze the enemy's thinking seriously.
The story about Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara.
It's astounding. When he wanted to know what Ho Chi Minh would think about prolonged heavy airstrikes against North Vietnam, he would literally interview himself. He'd ask what he would think if he were Ho Chi Minh.
Assuming the Vietnamese leader would respond rationally in the same way a Western leader would?
Assuming he would respond to American escalation based on a Western rational cost-benefit analysis. He would later discover, often disastrously, that Ho Chi Minh did not share his opinion about acceptable risk.
That is just a staggering admission of failure to understand the enemy's motivation, that the depth of their anti-colonial nationalism just outweighed any logical cost calculation.
And it underscores the institutional compartmentalization problem. The Vietnamese communists operated Datron as a seamless whole. Military, diplomatic, political, economic action, all directed by a single organ, the Politburo.
While the U.S. response was fragmented.
Completely fragmented. The military did orthodox activities, the State Department handled diplomacy, the embassy handled political relationships, the Central Intelligence Agency handled covert action.
So who was ultimately responsible for dealing with the enemy's integrated political military infrastructure in the villages?
That responsibility fell into the cracks between agencies. Much of the enemy's day-to-day activity was what the U.S. considered non-military, and so it was beyond the domain of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam.
It wasn't until the creation of CORDS that the response achieved any semblance of coordination.
That's right. the Civil Operations and Rural Development Support Organization. And that wasn't fully operational until after the Tet Offensive. They finally established the organizational structure necessary to fight Do Tron, but it was far too late to reverse the political outcome.
And this failure to unify the American effort allowed the Vietnamese communists to implement their most ingenious strategic element, psychological warfare and the change of venue.
They deliberately used strategic communication, that Ditch Van Pillar, to shape external perception and turn the democratic system's own weight against itself. Pike refers to this as using a judo principle.
They knew they could never defeat the U.S. military in a conventional set-piece battle.
So they focused on achieving political exhaustion in the U.S.
They sought to make the conflict a test of virtue that the U.S., with its democratic openness and free press, was inherently incapable of winning.
They played on the inherent complexity of a democracy fighting a protracted war. They asserted to the civilian population at home and abroad that the war was unjust, framing it as a necessary social change against a corrupt foreign puppet regime.
Their goal was to achieve a fundamental change of venue.
A change of venue. Shifting the primary test of the war away from the battlefield, where the U.S. was overwhelmingly dominant, to the political and psychological realm.
Where the U.S. was most vulnerable.
And the mechanism that made the U.S. vulnerable in that realm, it was the temporal syndrome.
The temporal syndrome.
The inability of a democracy to sustain a protracted conflict that appears endless, especially when the costs in blood and treasure are high. By drawing the conflict out in time, they manipulated perception so that what was communist aggression looked like merely necessary social change or justified rebellion.
Which subverted U.S. support at home, inhibited American diplomacy abroad, and placed massive military limitations on American forces in Vietnam itself.
Ultimately ensuring that the war would be decided by political will, not by military capability.
This deep dive into the historical sources on the Vietnam conflict, it reveals that the challenge of hybrid warfare is far more than just facing both guerrillas and conventional troops.
Oh, much more.
It's a fundamental challenge to the way large, complex states wage war.
The essential takeaway is that hybrid warfare demands a unified, comprehensive, strategic response. It means dealing with an enemy who possesses the strategic vision to unify political, military, economic, and diplomatic pressure into a seamless, high-efficacy whole, or Do Tron.
And U.S. military prowess failed because the system itself was structurally incapable of fielding an equally unified counter-apparatus.
It was a failure of structure and perception, not a failure of courage or technology.
The great lesson from Douglas Pike's analysis is that the Vietnam War really demonstrated that a democracy may struggle profoundly to fight a protracted conflict that appears endless. The internal political will is the greatest vulnerability.
And that enduring vulnerability is so crucial today. I mean, considering the Vietnamese communist success in forcing the strategic test off the battlefield and into the political arena.
Exploiting the temporal syndrome and the prison of competing perceptions.
Right. We have to ask, what new technological or social means might future adversaries use today to replicate that success?
It's sobering thought.
Think about the speed of information, the pervasive influence of social media, and the ability to disseminate targeted narratives instantly. A contemporary adversary might use a sophisticated digital ditch van to achieve an immediate global change of venue, exploiting the speed of modern media to undermine national resolve.
Forcing the next major conflict to be decided not by the size of the conventional military,
but by political support at home. That psychological battlefield is the enduring legacy of Do Tron.